All right, so here's a few news articles you might like. This one I thought was pretty interesting. This thing here is an asteroid, and it is so loosely bound that it's falling apart. The center is becoming liquid and it's spinning apart. And it turns out there's this thing called York forces. The asymmetry of the surface caused the sunlight to heat it up, and it emits light in a way that amplifies its spinning motion until it spins apart. It takes a long time, but this thing will sort of self-destruct just from the light hitting it. The Air Force is putting Kubernetes so it can deploy machine learning algorithms on flying devices. So they're not yet having it, it's going on these U-2 spy planes. So it's not controlling weapons yet, but it is moving in the direction of sort of the science fiction movies where you have robots fighting among themselves. And Apple is under a lot of criticism. Apple controls the Apple Store. And if you have an app in the store, they force you to take all financial transactions through the app, and they take 30% off the top of everything you do in there. And there were companies like a free secure email provider that wanted to have a free app, and Apple told them you either have to add something to pay for it and charge money in the app so we can get a cut, or we're going to kick you out. So they're forcing people to become for profit when they'd rather be free, and so on. So people are getting really upset. And this is what, if the Democrats win, many people expect there to be serious efforts to regulate and probably break up the major tech monopolies. And in general, it is something on the order of abuse of monopoly for Apple to control most of the smartphone market and then to control the gateway of all the software that goes on the smartphone market. So that we need more logical to break those up into two companies or something like that. Here's a good video of real doctors and nurses talking about how angry they are at Fox News. Fox News, and especially Donald Trump and the Republicans, have all decided to make it a point where you don't wear a mask and infect everybody around you with COVID as a political statement. And the doctors and nurses don't appreciate this as the hospitals fill and they die from secondary infection. But it's still continuing, and Trump has just amplified it again by claiming that he had yet another miracle cure. And so, this is part of why America is being viewed with horror by the whole world as they watch us deliberately spread the virus and die by the hundreds of thousands for no good reason at all. We used to laugh at other countries where they would try to distribute a vaccine, and the tribal people in the bush that were non-technological would not believe in the vaccine and they wouldn't take it, so you couldn't stop things even when they were medically curable. And now we're exactly like that. A perverse anti-fact religion has taken over a lot of our people to where they refuse to take necessary medical treatment and create a disaster for us all, and we're unable to do anything about it. So, that's one good side of this, is Americans like me that used to believe we were better than other countries have pretty much had to give that up and realize we have exactly the same ridiculous, horrible, stupid things going on here that they have going on in other countries. For a while, it seemed like we didn't, but not anymore. So this one kind of surprised me. The CEO of Google is tired of working from home, and whereas I'm really finding it work better. But see, the thing is, he's an executive, and executives actually apparently find some value in all these meetings. Now, all my life it's been, I'm doing work, I'm accomplishing something, and the administrators make me go to a meeting, which is completely worthless, a total waste of time, frustrating and pointless, until they stop having a stupid meeting and I can get back to work. And that, I think, is the way most tech people feel. But executives apparently have the sensation that there is some point to having meetings, and if something good happens in the meetings, and that whatever that good thing is, it doesn't happen over Zoom. Now, I've never noticed anything good happening in face-to-face or over Zoom, but at top executives, they spend all day in meetings, and I guess to them something is happening. I suspect this is related to the sales jobs. I went to a conference, downtown from Splunk, and all morning they had a guy in a suit up there talking, and he talked for 3 hours and he did not say anything. This is the same sensation I feel when I watch politicians. They can talk for hours and there's not even one bit of data. So whatever's going on there, it is something that's totally missing me. And whatever goes on in these meetings is something I cannot comprehend. But he values it, and he says it doesn't happen correctly over Zoom. Anyway, so Twitter is talking about doing yet more to block misinformation, which will, of course, primarily be aimed at Trump because he's the #1 source of misinformation in America. And so they're going to have techniques to try to flag things that are false and do something about it, and we'll see what happens. I know Facebook is very much supporting Trump and helping Trump deceive the nation and helping him get reelected, and they really like it that way. And when the anger gets too loud, they pretend to do something about it. So their latest pretense is they say after the election, they'll get rid of the political ads because, of course, they won't matter anymore. And nobody will want to have political ads after the election. So it's a way to pretend to do something without actually doing anything. The thing that hasn't happened yet is Zuckerberg running for president. It's pretty obvious he wants to do it. I would expect it maybe next time. Anyway, so they've got a self-erasing chip, and the idea is you store memory on it, but if it gets exposed to light, it will erase itself. So I think the point is you could have a tamper evidence chip to tell if people have been opening the case. So they're working on that. All right. Anyway, I think I'll just move on to the official class material. We're up to the time. So here we are at 160, and we're going to finish chapter 3 here. I've only done the first two parts of chapter 4, but I'll post another couple of these pretty soon because we're going to cover more of that chapter this semester than I have in the past. And there's one student that says they want to give a presentation, so we'll do that after the lecture. All right. And by the way, I updated the slides. There were a lot of typographical errors in them, so if you care, you can get the new version. Didn't change any real content. Anyway, so operational risk management is trying to deal with the financial losses. So this is an operational risk is something bad that would happen that causes your business to stop operating. So your security controls could fail, some external event could happen, like obviously we're having one in America. Our complete abject failure to do anything at all about coronavirus has essentially ended several major parts of our sector. I think movie theaters, airplanes, restaurants, in-person college teaching, all these things are gone, and to where a lot of those businesses are just gone forever. So that's an external risk. That's an external event that will attack your company. And the question is, can you survive it? And hopefully by planning enough, you could survive some degree of external attack or other failures. So you do this by deciding what recovery procedures you're going to have, and you decide that based on how necessary certain things are to your business. So you have recovery objectives. This is how long it's going to take for you to switch to alternative systems or bring the original systems back on. And you also have to consider the third-party risks. Almost nobody works alone anymore. Everybody uses a lot of third parties, and they often don't consider about the risks that come in from the third parties. So you've got a risk register here, which is a log of your risks and what you've done about them to help you understand your current security posture and how to improve it. So you have all these time objectives, all these measurements of how you're going to recover after a bad thing happens. So the recovery time objective is how long it takes you to turn on some system so you resume performing that function. So if your web server goes down, how long before you get some version of the web server back up again? That's the simple thing. And of course, not everything is equally important. For example, if you are a retail face-to-face business and you have point of sale terminals, then you probably want them to come back up really fast during the day when the doors are open and customers are shopping. But at night, when there are no customers, it wouldn't matter if they stay down for longer. So this is connected in the IT devices with your data classification and your asset classification. You figure out how important the data is, how urgent it is that it be available, and you assign short recovery time objectives to things that you really have to have or your operation will stop. For example, if you are Google, your web server clearly has to have a small RTO. You can't have the web server down because if it's down, nothing of Google's function is going. So they have enormous redundancy for it. Of course, that is their #1 thing. Whereas City College, if the City College website goes down, it could be down for a couple of days and it wouldn't really matter unless you're at the moment when students are registering for classes. You don't really need the website to do ordinary business. All right. So you can establish these things. One thing you can do is interview people in management at various levels to see how important this part of the business is and how long we could stand for it to be down. And then you get, of course, the higher executives are the opinions that prevail if there's a disagreement. In principle, it should come from a business impact analysis where you analyze how much will our business be harmed by some period of time of these things being unavailable, and that's part of business continuity planning. Now, the recovery point objective is another issue. Suppose your computer systems crash. The recovery time objective is how long before you bring them back up. But the recovery point objective is how much data was lost. If you back up every night, then if your systems crash at like 4 p.m., you're going to lose essentially a whole day's worth of work and have to do it over. So even if you can recover quickly, which is recovery time objective, your recovery point might be as much as 24 hours in the past. That's how much data you've lost. So that's an issue here. And if you don't want to lose a whole day worth of data, you're going to have to arrange some system of making some kind of backup copy of the data more often than that. And then you have recovery capacity objective. If your primary systems are down and you switch to some kind of secondary system, then you can decide how much capacity can you handle. This is what's happened from the ransomware attack on the hospitals. It's hit the news a lot this week. A whole major hospital chain in America has been hit by ransomware, so they're having to write everything by hand on paper, and that makes it so much slower that they cannot serve as many hospital patients in the same period of time. So now people who need to go to the hospital have to be sent off to some other hospital, and that's what causes people to die. And there are claims that at least one person has already died from this attack, in that they had to go to the hospital, and just because their systems are down, they had to be transferred, and they were so sick they died from being transferred. Then you got a service delivery objective. This determines how good your service is compared to normal operation, response time, features, and so on. This is very common that your main system goes down, so you switch to some kind of inferior backup system that doesn't really do the whole job, and you can measure what percentage of the job is really being done by your alternative system. And there's the maximum tolerable downtime. How long could you stand for some part of the business to just be down? And then you can work from this to plan these other numbers. So for example, if your website, maybe you could stand for your website to be down for a few days, but your payroll, to pay your employees, well, you probably only pay them once every 2 weeks or once every month anyway. So it might be all right for your payroll system to be down for, say, a whole month, because it wouldn't really affect you enough that too many of your employees would quit or anything. And then you got how long you can operate in your temporary recovery mode. City College has 2 layers of firewalls. We have a very strong Palo Alto firewall, but it can't really necessarily handle all the traffic. So if it goes down, then there are other firewalls behind it that are less secure, but can handle more throughput. So if one layer of defense fails, we run at a less safe mode for a while, and that's a fairly common arrangement. So you can tolerate an outage of one system, and there's another compensating control, providing some degree of safety even when the main control is down. And then if you can have these inside your company or outside service level agreements. Microsoft is very proud of having broken their company up into business sections, and they have internal contracts where the IT department will promise to provide a certain level of service to, say, the sales department, and they have an internal contract, just like they have with external vendors. That's the service level agreement. You promise to deliver a certain level of service, and if you fail, there is a punishment of some kind defined in the contract, like daily fines for being late. Okay, then you've got business continuity planning. They're very similar to risk management. You try to find out the risks you have and what you can do about them. So often based on the business impact analysis or a list of threats. And then, of course, the third-party risk management, which is a big deal. Everybody is now using cloud services like crazy, like Gmail and OpenDNS and Amazon, just tons of services. And now some important part of your business is running on other people's stuff out of your control. So you can't really evaluate your risk without including the risk that those services will fail. And what are you going to do about it? Which is difficult because you can't control those services, and you might not even be able to find out very much about what they're doing. And these days, they say more than half of all breaches come through third parties. I was just in an Amazon training, and they were talking about the number one risk in the last couple of years is people put data on the Amazon cloud and they don't secure it at all. So it's open to the whole world. So I guess you could say it's coming through a third party. You could argue whether it's their fault. I mean, they tell you that you have to set permissions on it, but if you don't, then they would, I'm sure Amazon would say that's not our fault, that's your fault. Our server is up and running according to the specifications and you're just configuring it wrong. But I'm sure a lot of companies would try to blame it on Amazon. But anyway, you cut it, since you're using a third-party service, you end up with a risk that you might not have had if you just ran your own data center. So there's infrastructure as a service, there's platform as a service, and software as a service. And you can see in software as a service, it's all up to the provider. Software as a service is a service like Gmail, where you don't control anything. All you do is make an account and log in, and everything is up to them. All the security, the firewall, the protocols, the data storage, the backups, it's all totally out of your control. So you're totally counting on your provider for all that. Whereas if they provide a platform, but you put on your own software, or if they just provide computing hardware and you install your own operating system and your own software, then the organization is more responsible for what happens and more responsible for the security. There are different levels of these things. And so you might outsource all these parts of your business, you know, the human resources. A lot of people outsource their customer relationship management, so, and many other things. And of course, if you do that, then you're trusting that third-party provider to protect all that stuff. So you got a life cycle. You, on your third-party risk management, you assess the risk, you have some kind of legal agreement, hopefully, and then you can send out questionnaires and get some kind of records back, recording what their procedures are and deciding whether they are secure enough, and then figuring out what you're going to do to mitigate the risk. So your initial assessment would be comparing various platforms. This is what the Department of Defense just did. They had a giant program called JEDI, which was $10 trillion or $10 billion or something like that, that was going to go either to Microsoft or to Amazon. And they spent something like a year evaluating them, and eventually went with Microsoft, and it's not over yet because Amazon sued. But anyway, you make a request for information or a request for proposal. They propose to provide the service. Then you have proof that they meet your security standards and whatever other requirements you have. And then you try to evaluate, putting it all together, which one of these would be the better choice. Then you get a legal agreement promising exactly what you're getting, what you're paying, and what will happen if they fail to provide what they promised to provide. And so you've got a security section. Often it's going to tie you to standards, audits and certifications like ISO 27000 or SOC 2. That's a very handy way to quantify your level of security so we know what we're talking about, just like students might get certifications like CISM and Security Plus and so on, so that an employer knows a simple way to understand what you know. And so then there's going to be a notification requirement explaining this. I saw someone, security professional, a couple of days ago on Twitter saying their vendor, the person, their customer says, you must notify us of every security incident within 5 minutes. And they're like, that's insane. I mean, you know, if you have a security incident, like a firewall notification, you don't even know if it's real or a false alarm right away. So do you really want me to just send you a flood of 1,000 events per day? Expecting us to alert the third party within 5 minutes is highly unreasonable, but within 24 hours or a couple of days, that's reasonable. By then you should know whether you really had an incident or not. Then you have people that play games like Uber. Uber got hacked, and then they paid the ransom, and they decided to call it a bug bounty and say, there, that wasn't a hack. And that seemed to cover it up for about a year or two, and then they got sued and they actually had to admit it was a breach and so on. But that's the point. All these things are, people are dodging and weaseling out of their obligations. And then you might have other things like a right to audit your systems or your records, and your due diligence is trying to monitor your third-party companies to see that if they're doing what they should be doing. Now, you might just give them a questionnaire where they have to fill out something promising they're doing things, or you might require that they actually hand you something like evidence, like computer-generated logs or other kinds of documents backing up their claims that they're doing things. So you can now classify your third parties. There's a huge range. I used to know some students that were starting online businesses, and they would go to some place, like there's some place called hostfor2bucks.com. And it was just going down in miserable service and unsafe. There was a guy that invited me to bring my class in to tour his data center because he was an ISP providing service to people, and he was providing people web hosting service and email service, and he had one little Windows NT 3.5 server with no firewall and no antivirus running under a sink with some wires going into it, and that was his data center. So people are paying him for service, and that's what they're getting. No backups, no nothing, because they don't check to see what you're getting. And if all you do is go for the lowest price, then that's very likely what you're actually getting. So the questionnaires are just, you send them a questionnaire, they have to fill it out, and then at least they promise to do something, and evidence would be some kind of artifact to support that. PCI, for credit card information, is one place that's got a good system here. They do it by how many transactions you have per year. And so if you have less than, I think, 50,000 transactions per year or something, then all you do is fill out a questionnaire. They just say, you should say, we do encrypt stuff, we do have a firewall and things like that. And they don't try to inspect to see if that's true. Whereas if you have more, like 1 million transactions or more, then you actually have to pay for a third-party audit and a penetration test from a trusted vendor who will come in and check your systems and make sure that you really are doing all that stuff you should be doing. So here's the kind of artifacts you might send in: a copy of your policy, your training records, your employee background checks and non-disclosure agreements, your insurance policies, and so on. Those are documents you might provide to prove that you are in fact meeting reasonable security standards. So when you first start doing business with a third party, then you can have this assessment go on, and then you can have some periodic assessment or audit where you check these things. And you may consider the financial risk. That's why a lot of companies have to have insurance, so that if they do something horrible and your business gets sued, they are on the hook for some part of that. And you might know their reputation, the breaches, and some measure of how effective their operation is. How much do you think they could actually handle a security incident? There are services you can subscribe to, commercial services, that will just tell you about risks and events out there. And a lot of companies do. So very often they do outrageous things, like have no internal firewalls, no encryption, things like that. And so if you do find that they're doing something which is unacceptable to your company, then you could either terminate your relationship with them and try to find a better vendor. But people are often very reluctant to do that because it's a very big job. And what they'd rather do is like try to pressure them into being more secure if you can. But unless you're a really big, important customer, they might not be willing to change their policy for your pressure. So you might have to look into other things. Like, for example, you might be able to add encryption at your end, so that the data that goes to them, even if they are not encrypting it again, at least you put a layer of security on it. These are sort of things you might consider. Anyway, let's take a look at the Cahoots. 3D1. It's this one. I think that's probably it. With that. All right, so a contract with a vendor. Service level agreement. All right, a percentage of normal business efficiency. That's recovery capacity objective. All right, a common kind of audit. Okay, SOC audit. Here, very common. A lot of companies are getting SOC audits. All right. And the weakest form of due diligence. That's just a questionnaire. You just ask them if they're doing the right thing or not. All right, that's boo. All right. I guess that person probably doesn't want points. That person might not want them either, or maybe they'll have to, okay, they told me who they are, that's good. All right. All right. Before I continue, I got a question asking about the papers, which are due, which is a good point. Let me see when they're due. This is, they're due on the 17th, which is a week. No, the 24th, right. So if you want to know about the paper, I think the only requirement is up here, 500 to 1,000 words, properly formatted and free of plagiarism. That's all we have. It doesn't really matter what the topic is, as long as it's something related to security or management, which is a pretty broad thing. And here's an example of a newspaper article that's the right length and such. So it just has to be, that's all we care. We're going to check, it has to be not stolen and just reasonably clear and grammatical and spelled correctly up to normal business standards. That's all we're looking for. Oh, and I see you tell me who visiting is. Good. Okay. Good. Anyway, that's important. The papers are coming and you should write them. Like I say, I want to see that you can communicate in writing up to normal business standards, and you can communicate in a verbal presentation, an oral presentation. That's what point of these presentations and papers. All right. So the risk register is a written document you create showing what you have found for your risks and what you have done about them. So it's the main thing in your risk management program. If you don't even have a risk register, then your program is at a very low level of maturity and you're not going to be able to handle security incidents very well. So this is an early step, and improving your register is a measure of your success as you move forward. So you'll have a lot of things in here. You have to have a complete entry, although of course you go through stages of developing this. So you've got some kind of identifying number, the person who created it, the source of the event, like a risk assessment or a security incident or something, then some kind of description of the problem, who attacked you, what vulnerability was involved, what harm it did, what asset it affected, and how likely this is to happen, and what kind of treatment you're going to put in here to prevent it, how much you feel like you've lowered it, and how much it cost to do all that. These are all important information to look at because you're very likely to have a similar event in the future where you have to compare to this one, or it'll turn out that your treatment was not sufficient and you have to increase your treatment. And so you'll want to look and see what did we do last time and how will we improve that for next time. So you've got people who approved it, people who performed it, and just the record of everything you did. Just like the police have, complete crime reports, so that when another crime related to that one happens, they can read that report to make a better plan how to deal with the new one. So all these things might be sources of information: your risk assessment, your audits, your threat intelligence feeds, things you learn from the industry, and of course, changes like laws and regulations that affect your business, a very big issue in America. They keep changing laws and adding more regulations, and that affects, of course, your financial and legal risk. And it also affects what you're allowed to do to protect yourself. So strategic risks are what should be in the risk register. These are big things that affect the entire organization. That's the level at which you have risk register. If you have tactical risks, little things like vulnerability scans of individual systems, that doesn't go directly in the risk register. You might have some other record of that for one business division or something, but that's not the big risk register. So you'll have risk analysis. So you have a problem. For example, if your software development team keeps producing defective code, which is almost universal. Most people I know working in the industry say companies have appalling practices because, as our guest was talking about on Monday, your company probably has a lot of people who haven't really stayed motivated and stayed updated on current practices. They're just trying to coast to retirement without putting in much effort. So they're probably doing things the way they were done 5 or 10 years ago. And that typically means they're doing appalling, insecure practices. So it's a problem. This is one form of technical debt. And so if you do have people that keep on using unsafe practices in your code, then you can try training them. You can have some kind of incentive program to make them make more secure code. You can add some kind of quality control where you scan the code. And all these are possible ways to deal with it. You might have penetration tests or add layers of defense outside your code, like web application firewalls, where your coders continue to write old-fashioned vulnerable code, but you put an external defense that blocks some of the attacks. These are all things you can do. So whatever you do to lower the risk, you never lower it to zero. So there is some residual risk. And then you might discover that even the leftover risk is still too high, and you have to go through more layers of treatment to try to get the risk down to an acceptable level. Especially since, of course, none of this is very scientific. You really don't know how big the risks are. You really don't know how effective your treatments are. It's all just you're just trying to sort of guess your way forward. And so it's basically a big pattern of trial and error. So you try to integrate risk management into your processes. There's an old rule that says a bug will cost $1 to fix in development. It'll cost $10 to fix in quality control after you finish development, and it will cost $100 to fix after you sold the product to the client, and now you have to put out a patch or a recall, which should be kind of obvious. It would be much, much better to consider your risks early and fix them early in the development process. It will be much cheaper, just like countries that actually have, for example, socialized medicine, so people can go to the doctor and get treatment early to prevent diseases, save a ton of money as compared to America, where we don't let people get medical treatment, so they stay untreated until they're a disaster and go to the emergency room. This is much more expensive. Anyway, so you got all these things happening in your company. You're developing software, you're doing changes in your equipment and processes, and the configuration of your devices, and your physical security and your human resources. All these things are business processes that carry some risk, and you should be considering the risk as you do them. So when you design products, you should consider the risks involved. And change management is a big issue. Small companies and less informal companies, people just buy routers and hook them to the network, bring in home devices and connect them, wire up another building and just add it in. But there comes a point when that's not good enough, because adding something new may have an unexpected effect on the rest of the company. So you ought to have at a company that gets organized, you have a formal request for a change, which explains, I want to change something. I want to add a new domain controller and connect it to the system and then have new people at this new location connecting or something like that. So you explain how you're going to do it, how you're going to verify that it worked, how you're going to back out and undo it if it doesn't work, because there's a large chance anytime you change anything that it's going to fail. And now you're going to wish you could go back to the previous system before you made this supposed upgrade. And so you plan for that. If it's going to take you 3 hours to back out, you make sure and leave the time so that there's a deadline. We're going to keep working on it until this time. And if it doesn't work by then, we're going to abandon it and roll back so that when the business starts up again, they will find that things are at least as good as they used to be. And so you have to consider all the consequences. Then you give it to a change review board and they consider it and tell you whether you can make the change or not. Configuration is the same thing. Configuration is the setup of your routers and switches and your firewalls and your group policies and all these things. You have all these configuration settings in your devices, and you have to protect the configuration data itself from unauthorized access. One of my early adventures in the world of security was I read a textbook that told me about a common error here, and I just Googled and found a major hospital's configuration page, including their passwords that were not properly encrypted. This kind of thing happens. There's often security information in the configuration data, so it itself is data that should be protected. So you have incidents, security incidents, and there are some considerations here. Your personnel need to consider what they might be doing. For example, they might decide to change a firewall without considering how that's going to affect other parts of the company. Things you do to restore service might have security impacts. And when you do root cause analysis to figure out what went wrong, you may have security impacts. Like you're going to find things that were unprotected, like Amazon buckets open to the whole world. Now you might say, well, I'll put some security on them, but you have to figure out who's actually using it. And there might be parts of your business that have been developed to just expect that to be wide open. And so you won't know. And your corrective actions here may cause some part of the business to stop working. So it is an issue. All right. So you have physical security too, just people physically breaking into buildings and stealing things and such. So that's another issue. Your high availability systems have to have physical security. In Europe, they have decommissioned nuclear weapons stations that are now used to house servers because they say they can withstand a war and terrorism and such. People don't usually worry about that quite as much in America, although we're beginning to worry about it. Our physical security is somewhat higher here at the moment. Anyway, so you got to integrate these things into your programs, and you have to monitor your environmental systems, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. One possible attack on physical security is to shut off your air conditioner, or indeed get on your network that way. This is how Target got hacked. Their systems were secure, but their heating, ventilation, and air conditioning company had a login, and they managed to come in through that to get in the network and deploy malware. So your enterprise risk management has its own risk register, which may or may not be separated from the other company one. And you have your human resource issues. Do you actually call the references? Most people don't. That's why 80% of resumes now contain lies. You can just claim to have a degree, claim to have a job, and most people will not check. So that's a failure to do your background checks. And then you have training and development of your people to make sure they know what they're doing and they know what's expected of them. So when you start a project, like deploying new servers, you perform a risk analysis and decide how you're going to check to make sure that you're not causing a problem as a result of your project. And then you got monitoring and reporting, the closed loop of this giant loop we're describing, where you have policies at the top specifying what you want to do. You have all kinds of people in the middle implementing it. Then you have to have some measurement to see how well are we achieving our goal and have a loop to continuously improve. So you can have internal audits, vulnerability assessments, and the main people that see this are executive management. They would like to look at progress meeting, they go to progress meetings, and they want to see some kind of measure of how are we doing on this and that part of the business. So you got risk indicators, things like this. How many incidents have there been? So for risk indicators, you have number of vulnerabilities found. This is one that's pretty much useless everywhere. There's been an argument in the security community for more than 10 years. Some people say Windows is less secure than Linux because Windows had 500 vulnerabilities last year, but Linux only had 200. And you say, well, vulnerabilities are not all equal. That isn't really a fair comparison. The number of vulnerabilities is not clear. What's a lot more meaningful is say, how long does it take you to fix a problem when it happens? Then I can tell if your team is getting better or not. Anyway, other things you can do, number of security incidents where we had to externally notify somebody. Are the employees staying or quitting? How much money are we paying out to bug bounties and so on? These are reasonable other attempts to measure the success of your program. It reminds me of the college. I mean, the college is always going through budget cutting and budget crisis. And then you say, well, why don't they give the money to the important program and cut the unimportant program? And there's no real way to measure importance of a college program or even success of a college program. It's the same here. You have some program running and it's not incredibly obvious how to measure its success. So you seek a meaningful number that you can track and see whether it's getting better or not. And one of the main ones in incident response is time to handle an incident. That's widely regarded as a good measure of the overall maturity of your program. Time to detect a problem and time to remediate the problem. Anyway, so another big issue is that your employees often just do the wrong thing for a variety of reasons. They often don't understand how to use the equipment. They don't understand what risks are caused by them doing something like, why don't I just put this company data on my home device? Is that okay or not? They don't know what the rules are. They don't know what they're supposed to do when they find something wrong. This is a problem in totalitarian systems where the abuse is too much. For example, the Trump administration is extremely based on revenge and abuse. Everybody is terrified of Trump. He fires people like crazy. He blacklists them. He ruins them. And so everyone's afraid to do anything that might offend him. So I'm sure a ton of people in the White House would like to wear masks and not catch coronavirus, but they know that they have to just try to not be noticed and try to do what's happening, or they'll be afraid they're going to get hurt. And such situations lead to people covering things up where they don't, you don't even find out what's happening. So you need to have a process where people know who they should tell about a problem and they feel safe enough that they think they can tell you about a problem without being punished unjustly for it. Anyway, and then you've got documentation. Your policies have to be, of course, written down. People have to know who's responsible for things, your methods, and where to store things, and what your risks, what tolerance you have for risks, what the rules are, what your treatments are, and how you're going to deal with problems and escalating them, and how the review cycle will go to measure things. This is another big issue at the college. There have been attempts to try to measure the success of the teachers. They now have us fill out very many forms at the end of every class online, very many records of everything about every student to a large extent. And then they promised us they would not use that to evaluate teachers. And then they did in fact use it to evaluate teachers and talk about firing them. It's a big issue. And in a more organized place, you would try to have clear rules people understand so they know what they're supposed to be doing and they know whether they're succeeding. But colleges are notoriously poorly organized. They're not organized like big companies. They run typically more like small companies where people don't have clear expectations. And so I saw that in the news. Ants is a new Chinese company, I think. All right. probably it. Guess so. The risks that affect the entire organization. Strategic, the big picture. All right. Which item will lower the risk? Treatment, just like a medical treatment. All right. Which one uses a CMDB? Change management database is what that is. All right. All right. Which business unit has its own risk register? All right. The enterprise risk management has its own. All right. So, overflow, we'll have to tell me who they are. Yates, I think it's real initials. And Boo, I know who that is. All right. Good. All right, I'm going to stop the recording. And we have a student.